Hi guys, welcome to Formula 1 news. Over the last 4 Grand Prix weekends, there have now been 4 different teams on pole position. A banger quali day today in Barcelona, especially on a weekend where there were serious fears that Red Bull and Max Verstappen would go back to absolutely dominating every single session. That could still happen on the Sunday, but on today's performance, Lando Norris and McLaren put together a performance that was good enough to steal pole position away. One of the big talking points though, of course, was Mercedes replicating their qualifying performance to some extent to what they had in Montreal, and Hamilton out-qualifying George Russell on a mega weekend of news at Mercedes, especially regarding all this sabotage discussion over the last couple of days. Is there something in that based on today's results? So much storyline to dive into today. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Speaking of McLaren on fire, on and off track today, a couple of their staff, I believe, or at least people in the paddock, were taken to hospital just to make sure they were okay in terms of smoke inhalation, because there was a fire, an electrical fire in the kitchen of McLaren's hospitality suite. So, bit of drama on this today. There was a fire, there was an evacuation. Thankfully, everyone, as far as I understand it, was okay. But let's give the latest update on this whole Mercedes sabotage stuff. We talked about it in depth yesterday, and we've got more to say based on the results of qualifying. If you guys aren't familiar with the story, if you've been living under a rock, a few races ago in Monaco, Lewis Hamilton says that he doesn't expect to out-qualify George Russell all year. He doesn't really expand on why at the time. And then during the Montreal Grand Prix in Canada, he said that his tyre temperatures were coming out of the blankets 2 or 3 degrees lower on the critical laps than he would have expected, and presumably what George Russell was getting, which was affecting his qualifying performance. Then Mercedes in midweek came out and said that, nothing of that sort is true. It's unfair to suggest such. And then there was this email that went around. We don't know the source of the email, and Mercedes have now apparently called the police to investigate the source of this anonymous email that's been doing the rounds in the media that, well, proposed, let's say, that the person sending it was working at Mercedes, although I think it was littered with spelling mistakes, and the way it was written didn't fill me with massive amounts of belief that's actually where it came from. But of course, the big question, as we discussed yesterday, was how did this individual get the access to the list of emails that basically the Christian Horner stuff was sent to earlier in the year before Bahrain? So it was a big talking point. Mercedes have now obviously emphatically denied anything's happening here today, but there is even more to say on it based on some of the comments Hamilton made on the radio during today's qualifying session. But Mercedes, of course, are denying any such activity, and they've called the police to investigate where the email originated from. So we'll see if that goes anywhere. But this whole Mercedes sabotage story is not going away, especially when, for the last several years now, since Hamilton and Russell were teammates, basically every single quali session they've been neck and neck. They're almost always within 10th, half a tenth, whatever. This year, on average, it's been a 10th and a half in George Russell's favour, which feels like there might be some sort of explanation behind that, whatever explanation you want to come up with. But of course, then today, after Hamilton had made his concerns public, all of a sudden it's back to basically being neck and neck again. So there's more to say on that over the coming minutes, of course. I did want to look quickly at some of the long run data over the free practice sessions, because whatever's happening in qualifying as it did today, the real question is what's going to happen in race conditions. And based on the runs that we saw in the long run pace, Verstappen does have the upper hand. This, by the way, I mean, what is Perez doing? Let's be real. I know this is FP2, so it is yesterday at this point, but he was literally a second down on Max. Now, Max was on the mediums, so technically slower tyres, but over let's say a 10-lap stint, probably going to be faster than the softs are over that type of stint. So it's difficult to read too much into this, but the data definitely implies that while Ferrari have some decent pace, Max is probably still the man to beat in terms of long run pace. There was some stuff done at Mercedes as well, but kind of difficult to read into this morning just because you don't know fuel loads and this type of stuff that was probably different between Hamilton and Russell based on the data here. So who really knows what's going on? Verstappen did some long tyre runs on the FP3 session, and seemed like there wasn't much degradation, but of course, again, it's difficult to say what were the power modes, what were the fuel modes, all this type of stuff, but just worthy keeping an eye on the fact that the data generally indicated today that the Red Bull is still going to be the fastest car in race conditions. But, I mean, let's be honest, we came into this weekend with some concerns. Max might just dominate every single session. This time last year, he was on pole by half a second or something, and his first run in Q3 was almost a second ahead of anybody else. So it's clear that while Red Bull still have the fastest machine probably probably around this circuit, although Norris just put together an absolutely mesmerising lap to take pole, as we'll see over the coming minutes, and probably Red Bull still have the fastest race car here for tomorrow, but it's not like it's a guaranteed victory for Max Verstappen anymore, as it would have been here last year, and it certainly was here the year before, once the DRS started working again. Okay, to be fair, Leclerc was leading that race. Who knows what could have happened, but the engine blew up, unfortunately. Now, drama, before we get into qualifying, on basically road rage. I don't really know what better way to explain it, but I don't know what was in the air in Barcelona today, but this was a moment when Hamilton, and you can actually see him putting his hand up to apologise here to Stroll, so Hamilton lost track of where Stroll was. I think also people have got to realise that when you're in these cars, super low to the ground, you've got these tiny wing mirrors. It's nowhere near as easy for these drivers to actually figure out where the other guys are behind them than it is for us. So we watch it, we see the camera views, we see the T-cam, we see like where the dots are on the map and everything. Like, it's easy for us to say, oh, he impeded him badly there, which often they do. But, you've got to also understand, it ain't easy to keep track of what everyone is on track unless your engineer's in your ear telling you what's going on. So anyway, Hamilton impeded. This is in practice. There's never going to be penalties for impeding in practice, really. But Stroll got marginally impeded here into turn 4, and he wasn't happy about it, and to such an extent that he literally turned into Hamilton. Like, he said, this guy, what did he say? What's the full quote here? This effing guy thinks he's alone on the track, which is kind of ironic in the sense that there's many instances that Stroll over the last few years has made decisions, shall we say, that appear as if he believes he's the only man on the track, but whatever. So then he decided, Hamilton was like, yeah, my bad, like I made a mistake, whatever. Stroll just turns into him. The funny thing is about this, I don't think it damaged Hamilton's car, but it damaged Stroll's car. Stroll's floor got torn up by this. So he got some damage that needed repairing and replacing, and in the end, there were big questions as to whether there was going to be a penalty for this, but actually it was just a reprimand, although this was interesting. He admitted that he wanted to express his displeasure to the other driver, Hamilton, by pulling over on him at the exit. Stewards say, though, this was erratic, but not dangerous. So they let him off with a reprimand. The other drama, though, of course, was between not even just these two. That was happening at the end of the straight down into turn 9, where Sainz was kind of all over the road and getting impeded. It was actually this moment when, again, Norris kind of impeded Leclerc. It wasn't like a bad impeding, to be honest, but Leclerc was clearly frustrated the way that his session was going. The car wasn't probably quite as compliant as he would have liked, but it's interesting that the Ferrari was better today than yesterday. They brought upgrades this weekend. They've not done as much as I think Ferrari would have hoped them to do, certainly in terms of their qualifying pace, although they have probably made some strides. Their race pace looks pretty good. And today in FP3, the car was definitely better than yesterday. So actually Leclerc was much happier with the car today than he was yesterday, but he was clearly still frustrated. Lando possibly could have got out the way on the exit, or the entry, to turn 4, just pulled to the left. He didn't. Leclerc wasn't happy about it, and this is the replay right about here, right? So basically, Norris impedes him, that he pulls over to the left-hand side, and Leclerc just straight up brakes. You can't really see from this angle, but he literally brakes, turns in on him, and then they make contact right about here. Like, there is actual contact made between the two drivers at this point. So this is as clear-cut, I think, as it gets in terms of intentional crashing, effectively. Now, this is in practice, and in practice it is pretty rare to see penalties at all. But there was talk that maybe this could deserve it. Shaw was on the radio saying, obviously he was pretty frustrated, we're not going to repeat that out loud. And then he went to the stewards, and clearly Ferrari cooked up some sort of defence here, because in the end, he was only given a reprimand. I think there was genuine concern among the Tifosi and the Leclerc fans that he was going to get a 3-place pen or something for this, such as Perez has, but for a different incident last weekend. We'll get onto Perez's day in a second, because, again, it wasn't exactly great. But, Leclerc given a reprimand for this, so they got away with that one, absolutely. And this is pretty funny, right? Look at this. The driver of car 16, so Leclerc, stated that he got impeded by car 4 into turn 5, and that upset him. Then he had to abort his flying lap and contended that, maybe I was saying turn 4 earlier, I meant turn 5, whatever, you guys get the picture. He contended that while trying to get off the racing line before turn 7, he misjudged the position of his car and made slight contact with turn 4. Now, do we believe that he just misjudged the position of his car and didn't intentionally crash into Norris, because that's what it looked like to me. But whatever, maybe Norris or maybe Leclerc, just misjudged the position of his car. Irrespective of any possible intent, the stewards consider the move, while not being dangerous, to be erratic and therefore issue a driving reprimand. And it's just pretty funny how it says, that upset him. It's just like the official terminology that they're using. Anyway, Leclerc gets away with it. I think he's probably quite lucky to get away with it in the grand scheme of things. But then qualifying gets underway, and what a session it was on the day. I mean, again, the gaps in qualifying were very competitive at the front, and that has been the case here before until like Q3, where Max will just put in a stormer. And to be fair, he did. But, well, we'll see how this goes in a second. Even early days, though, in Q1, we were starting to see Verstappen, Norris right to the front of the field here. Early doors, though, it was Alpine that were actually very commendable, and we'll talk about them more in a second. But Max straight away was saying, yeah, the car's better, right? Because they'd not struggled. Max actually said on the Friday that they weren't necessarily the fastest, but they were happy with where their car was. They were making the adjustments they wanted to make. And the general feeling at Red Bull is that, yeah, their car is really good around here. There was no concern. And on a traditional circuit, the Red Bull is going to be good. But it's not good enough to be dominant over the field, and you see this, right? If the Red Bull is truly dominant, Perez will be up there. If it's not truly dominant, Perez is nowhere, basically, compared to, Max fighting for pole every weekend. Leclerc and Sainz, they were putting in good lap times. It seemed early days that the Ferrari could be in the mix. The Mercedes in the hands of Russell early on wasn't too far behind, but it became quite clear that there was a couple of cars that were just straight up bad here, right? The Williams was one of them. Sargent was like so far off the pace as well. I don't want to give him too much flack just because Albon, despite doing some good early laps, he was actually P19 Albon in the end. But I think that the entire field had at least 4 tenths on Sargent, and then beyond that, like, is Sargent worse than Latifi? Like, it's actually a question, because this weekend the talk was, oh, well, Sargent's now, he's got the same spec car as Albon, right? Because basically Albon's car was lighter because of all the crash damage earlier on. They finally got him the same chassis, and, well, it's not like he delivered much with it, is it? And he's been out-qualified by Albon again. Just above them, though, were the 2 RBs. And that will be one of the key talking points here, actually, was the performance of the RB, because they brought major upgrades this weekend. They had so many new parts to their car, and Tsunoda and Ricciardo, like, poor Yuki, man, he was on the radio saying, yeah, great lap, guys, wasn't it? Like, I just absolutely nailed that lap. Like, it was lots of fun. And they were like, yep, good lap, but we're out in Q1. It was like, what do you mean we're out in Q1? Like, that was a banger lap, but they just don't have the pace. But as we get into Q2 and beyond, this is when the talk about the whole Mercedes sabotage stuff with Hamilton comes up again, because Hamilton talked about it in Montreal, that his tyre temperatures coming out of the blankets were not where he wanted them to be. Mercedes haven't commented on this specifically. I'd be interested to see if Mercedes, do they have the data for this? They must have the data, right? Like, if they want to say, look, Lewis was not true, like what Lewis said wasn't true, can they not bring, a sheet of paper that says, hey, maybe they wouldn't ever try and do this because they don't want to, throw Lewis out of the bus or whatever, but could Mercedes not come out and say, look, hey, these were the tyre temps. What Hamilton was seeing on his dashboard was, not our fault or whatever. They don't need to do this, but it's like they could do this. And Hamilton is still making these statements going into Q2. Like, hey guys, let's make sure those tyre temps are right. Let's making sure they're coming out of the blanket to the same temperature they are as George is. And yeah, then we'll be fine. So I did think it was really interesting, actually, to hear this be said. And Bono was like, yeah, copy. We'll make sure it's okay for you today, Lewis, type thing. Which, according to him, it wasn't back in Montreal. And of course, all of a sudden, as soon as the tyre temps are apparently where Hamilton wants them to be, we see a rather different result in qualifying. So, is it just coincidence? That's a matter for you to speculate in the comment section below. This was how Q2 was turning out, though, because at this point I thought, yeah, Verstappen's going to get pole here. He usually finds more time in Q3, and he did, and he actually did for reasons of a bit of a toe behind Sergio Perez, but it wasn't actually quite enough in the end. I will say, though, the Alpines, I don't really know where some of this form and turnaround has come from, but it is impressive to think about that they've got a power disadvantage, they had a weight disadvantage, and at least they've put together a car now that's capable of being within a few tenths of the fastest car on track. Like, it wasn't completely embarrassing today for Alpine, it was actually pretty commendable. Then again, they're here last year, I think Gasly had a good performance, so it is still a step backwards. But at this point, the end of Q2, Alonso was gone, he really tried, but it wasn't enough. That Aston Martin just isn't good enough. Stroll was out, both Saubers, of course, Bottas in P12, Hulkenberg. Perez made it through, I'm not gonna lie, it was a bit touch and go for Sergio Perez. 4 tenths down he was in the end on Max, and he wasn't far away from getting knocked out by both of the Alpines at the end. But this is how Q3 initially gets underway. Verstappen puts in the provisional pole lap early on, and it was a good lap, but I think it was clear watching the onboard there was room for improvement in Verstappen's lap. Sainz, by the way, had a really good early run. Like basically the first sector, he had a banger sector 1, and it was because he was getting a big toe down the straight, I think from potentially Sergio Perez, who was just finishing a previous lap on the used rubber. But Sainz made a bit of a mistake he must have done in the final sector, because he had a real chance, Sainz, to put in a lap that should have probably contended for where Verstappen previously was. Wouldn't have mattered in the end because the guys improved, but it was certainly worth thinking about. Piastri didn't have a great lap here, and of course Perez was going to go again on the newer rubber. There was a bit of drama as well during these laps here, because Russell was behind Hamilton in the kind of Mercedes run. They do like, if you guys have ever watched Mercedes do qualifying, and they're not always the best at managing this, but they like to have their drivers relatively close to each other. They'll send one out first, the other one will follow about, 10 or so seconds behind them on the roads. And I think Hamilton took a quite slow preparation lap, which meant that Russell actually really had to kind of hurry up to get to the line in time. So again, it's like from the Mercedes side, in terms of the execution, it's not exactly on point, is it? And Russell is saying, what was going on there? What was he doing? And Mercedes are like, look, we'll talk about it afterwards. We know for Mercedes, this has been a good circuit for them historically. Hamilton's won here, countless times, might be 6 times. Did he win here 5 times in a row? Something like that anyway. It's been a good circuit historically for Mercedes. Even the last few years, 22, 23, they've done very well here in comparison to where they've done elsewhere. So it should be a good track for them. And it certainly did prove to be the case. But this is how things were looking at the end of Q3. Verstappen had just put in a mega lap. He got a toe, I think, from Perez down into turn 1. That put him at a 1:11.4 in the end. And I thought, wow, 3 tenths over Leclerc, bit more over Sainz, but super marginal between those two. There's no way. But Piastri was competitive with Max until he went off right here, where Norris is right now, into turn 10. He just overcooked it, bit of a tailwind through there, went off the track, and in the end Piastri was out P10. He will start the race P9 because Perez is going to get a 3-place penalty for what happened back in Montreal, basically driving back to the pits without his rear wing intact. We talked about that drama a few days ago. But man, what a lap from Lando Norris. We saw him do it here last year when he put in a stonking lap, but it wasn't good enough for pole position. Of course, he got sprint pole in China earlier this year, but this is his first pole since, Sochi 2021. I genuinely didn't think Max's lap was beatable, and again we see that it is McLaren who are, right now, Red Bull's closest challenger. Norris just puts in a storming lap, no toe I don't think to speak of, puts, 2/100ths of a second over Max Verstappen to take the P1. Now, it's a long run down into turn 1. We've seen Max take the lead from P2 there before. It may happen again. And but in the end, it was both Mercedes boys that pipped out Leclerc and Sainz by, we're talking fractions here. Like Hamilton was, we'll see the overall numbers here in a second, was 0.318 off pole. Russell was 0.320 off pole. And both Ferrari drivers neck and neck as well. So kind of what you expect at times from these two respective pairings. But yeah, very interesting to note. Obviously, the Lando pole is mega. The fact that Perez was P8 in the end and will be starting P11 after the penalty is definitely means that Verstappen has no wingman, but neither does Norris, right? Because Piastri is back here in P10. So actually, if anything, if the Mercedes has good race pace, they're not in a bad position here because they can play a bit of a team game, Hamilton and Russell. But again, the big talking point of this qualifying session really is, apart from the Lando mega pole position, is about the fact that after all the talk from Hamilton about, the sabotage, or at least implying that was the case, and then the email that's been going around, Mercedes have emphatically denied it, but then Hamilton's on the radio saying, okay, make sure my tyre temps are correct, and then they go into qualifying, and again, the drivers are neck and neck basically every single session, and Hamilton just about pips him on the line to out-qualify Russell for only the second time this season. So, as I say, is it a coincidence? Is there something in it? Hamilton was much happier today than he was previously, and for understandable reasons. Still though, 3 tenths on pure pace to the leaders in P1 and P2, so it's a pretty big gap at the end of the day for Mercedes and Ferrari to have a think about overnight. But nonetheless, good qualifying positions for those cars, and hopefully tomorrow is going to be a serious challenge. If it's a straight 1 versus 1 between Max and Lando, you've got to think that Max probably has the upper hand in terms of pure pace, certainly in the race numbers we've seen so far this weekend. But yeah, just hoping for another great Grand Prix, because genuinely it's not clear who's going to win, which is fun because it wasn't that way for quite a long time, although Max is going to still be the favourite even from P2 on the grid. But very much intrigued your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.